Compt, The Comeback Kid, a novel by Bill Kearney. Chapter 1. I got out of bed and walked over to the window. I looked out and took a deep breath. Snow covered the hotel grounds. A cool wind swept across the parking lot, blowing the snow around. It made me shiver slightly. I had a good night's sleep without any of those pestering nightmares. Hopefully I'll get through the rest of the day without any headaches. I stepped back from the chilly scene and smiled to myself while thinking, somehow, I'm still alive. Now, if I play my cards right, this time, after being thrown under the bus by both political parties over the last 20 years, I just might get my monthly statement safeguard put in all these dens of inequity. I joined Director Reverend Tom Green and members of his organization that's based right here in Washington, D.C. for breakfast. While there, we discussed our testimonies for the hearing that we're about to enter in the FTC, Federal Trade Commission headquarters. It didn't take long, and I wasn't surprised that after all these years they still have no idea how this so-called entertainment venue that is operating 24/7 in 44 states with absolutely no consumer protection works. Most of them are evangelicals from the Bible Belt states. They're church-going people who don't participate in this form of entertainment. They believe the duty of politics is to establish justice in a sinful world. Evangelicals thinking like that is good for them and for me. Here's why. Things have changed drastically since Laurent first ran for our 45th president. Back then, one of the biggest questions he faced was whether he could win over evangelical Christians. How could he, with him being a casino owner who dated playmates from the Playboy Mansion and was on his third marriage? The only thing he ever preached was the gospel of wealth and power. He needed evangelicals back then, and somehow he got them to hold their noses and vote for him. Things have changed since he became president. Now evangelical support is no longer a question. In fact, President Laurent is so popular with evangelical leaders they have come to think of him as a kind of messiah, the leader they've been waiting for. It was back in 2007 when Reverend Tom first heard about my monthly statements legislation and how I got Laurent way before he was president to say he'd mail them out quarterly if he gets a license to steal in Pennsylvania. He called me and invited me to speak at one of his organization's conferences being held in Pittsburgh, PA. He told me he set up a sit-down with the editorial department of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette when the conference is over. I asked him if they knew I was coming. He said yes. Then he asked me if that's a problem. I told him that I tried to get them to do a story on my monthly statement House bill when it was up for a vote in our House of Representatives, but they refused to. I got in a heated exchange with the head of their editorial department and her staff a few times. They, like many other media outlets, stopped taking my calls. I spent over an hour speaking and taking questions at the conference that day. I brought up my monthly statements along with my other safeguards that addresses the provisions our lawmakers sanctioned in order for them to seduce their prey. I wasn't sure they even understood what I was talking about, but Reverend Tom did. Reverend Tom and I walked into the meeting at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette late that afternoon. We entered a large room with half-glass panel walls. Through them you could see rows and rows of cubicles. Writers and reporters are at their desks on phones and computers. We took seats at a long table with a Catholic Church Monsignor, a pastor from an African American church, and the chief rabbi from a synagogue in Pittsburgh. On the other side of the table sits the head of the editorial department and her staff. After the religious leaders gave their reasons of why they were there, which had little to do with how these facilities operate, I asked the head editor why she didn't support my monthly statements legislation when it was up for a vote. After she gave some half-ass excuse about there being no proof that they were going to help anyone, I laid into her for being more interested in the advertising money they're going to get from this scam than she is the health and well-being of the citizens of her city. Before she gave her rebuttal, I told her when the crime, suicides, and families are destroyed, her and her newspaper will be held accountable. She got up from the table and said, "This meeting is over." She starts walking out and her staff follows her. Before she got to the door, I stood up from the table and out loud told her she's just another pimp for this plague that people like her brought upon us. She turns around, starts hollering at me, and I'm hollering back. Then she starts crying. I told her to save her crocodile tears for the casualties she's going to help them produce. Security guards escort me and the holy rollers out of the building. The Monsignor, pastor, and rabbi were bitching about that, but Reverend Tom didn't say a word. Once outside of the building, Reverend Tom told me it was the first time he ever got escorted out of a meeting by security guards. I was about to apologize, but before I could, he thanked me for doing what he expected me to do. I asked what he meant by that. He He told me my reputation of being a disruptor and somewhat of a bully, but in a good way, is enlightening others of the negative effects this industry is having on individuals and the local economy. I told him his friends he brought with him weren't happy, but that's okay. I never could get any help from religious leaders. They've been MIA, missing in action from day one. But that's going to change once they see their donations and Sunday collections diminishing. Even though we were from two different worlds, Reverend Tom coming from a religious background, and me being somewhat of an atheist, we became good friends. We had some intense conversations over the years with his belief in a creator, and my believing it's all made-up stories in order to keep the flock in place. But when it came to this vice, and especially after the mass shooting, we both agree on one thing. It's time to stop the breeding. That's why we're here today testifying in front of the FTC, Federal Trade Commission. Reverend Tom and his organization have been trying for years to get the FTC, whose mission is protecting the public from deceptive or unfair business practices, to investigate the flaws in the laws that govern this so-called entertainment industry. But their Washington lobbyists kept shutting it down. The only reason it's happening now and why I'm here is because of the mass shooting. We went into the hearing and took our seats at the table with microphones on them. After we were sworn in, we gave our opening statements. Then the testifying and questioning began. Reverend Tom mostly focused on immorality and social issues. I went right for the throat like I always do. I presented factual evidence that proves these facilities that are now doing business over the internet are operating with no consumer protection. I listed the provisions that lawmakers sanctioned in order for them to fill state tax coffers. I brought up my safeguards that address the deceptive business practices they're using that are unfair and harmful to consumers. Things like how they're cashing personal checks and offering interest-free credit. I explained how this industry is operating under the Treasury's Bank Security Act. So I asked if that would mean the feds would be able to make them mail monthly statements to their patrons. The chairperson couldn't answer that, but she did say she'd definitely look into it. I was making some headway with my safeguards, especially the monthly statements, one which the chairperson and her staff all agreed that it makes sense being these facilities already have in place a system that is tracking their patrons' money expenditures. The hearing lasted over 4 hours. I ended my testimony by saying this industry is operating like amusement parks without any safety belts or cages on their rides. Afterwards, Reverend Tom and I spent some time with the woman who is the new chairperson of the Federal Trade Commission. She said our testimonies were an eye-opener, and she is going to have her staff look further into my safeguards, especially the monthly statements one. Before leaving the hearing, Reverend Tom asked me if I had time to come out to his hometown in Omaha, Nebraska for a couple days to speak at town hall meeting in their capital. He said his childhood friend, who just so happens to be the CEO of a multinational conglomerate company and he's worth over $100 billion, will be there. He told me his friend had a lot to do with keeping them out of Nebraska, but the tide has changed. And it looks like by this time next year, Nebraska will become the 45th state legalizing this scam. You would think with his friend's kind of money you could stop this from ever happening. But his friend's money isn't filling Nebraska tax coffers like this scam will. And that's what matters. I took up Reverend Tom's offer and we caught a 3-hour flight to Omaha later that evening. We boarded the plane. I had the window seat and Reverend Tom sat next to me with his Bible in hand. I got on my cell phone to check my phone and text messages. He did the same. When we were done, he told me that his billionaire friend texted him and said he can't wait to meet me. In most people's worlds, a billionaire wanting to meet them would be something special, but for me it's just another day in La La Land. But I was curious to hear how Reverend Tom and he became friends. So I asked him how that happened. Before he could tell me, the plane prepares to take off. When it did, I looked out the window and on it I could see Reverend Tom's reflection. He was holding his Bible and praying to himself. Once the plane was airborne, we talked about his billionaire friend. Reverend Tom and his friend's family were cattle ranchers going back to when William F. Buffalo Bill Cody officially started his Wild West show in 1883. His friend's family ranch was twice the size of Reverend Tom's family's. They were competitors with one another, but they were good friends. There were many marriages between the families. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, his friend's family bailed Reverend Tom's family out from losing everything. Reverend Tom inherited the ranch in the late 60s when he was attending a Baptist seminary. He had no interest in ranching, so he sold it to his friend, who lets him live in the house where he was born in and raised his family. He talked more about his childhood life. To me, it sounded like Mark Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. When he finished, he got up to use the bathroom. Before he did, he said when he gets back, he wants to hear my childhood story. As he headed to the bathroom, I'm thinking, my childhood? I didn't have time for one. Ever since I can remember, the whole idea was to grow up, and that's exactly what I did in a mostly all-Catholic working-class neighborhood in northeast Philadelphia, 4 city blocks from St. Martin's Parish. There were Irish, Italian, Polish, German, and a few Jewish families in our neighborhood. We lived on the borderline, the last block before Jew Haven. I know that sounds prejudiced, but where I grew up, we tagged everything and everybody. The Irish were drunks, Italians were mobsters, Polacks were dopes, Germans were Nazis, and Jews were cheap. Even though there were no blacks in our neighborhood, we would frequently use the word nigger. It was the closest word to a curse you could say without getting your mouth washed out. Swearing, cursing, or whatever you want to call it was absolutely forbidden back then, and you had better never let your parents hear you cutting someone up about their nationality. If caught, you would surely get an ass whipping. It wasn't because our parents weren't prejudiced. I mean, come on now. Where do you think we learned all those things? Like I said before, everyone was prejudiced. We were living in a world of unlocked doors and very little violence where dads went to work and moms took care of the kids and home. Divorces were unheard of. Believe it or not, even kids had some manners. Remember now, there were only 3 channels on TV and there was one cardinal rule. Never buy anything made in Japan. I lived in a neighborhood packed block after block with row homes. I attended St. Martin of Tours parochial school. My mother was Italian, my father was a little bit of everything. I can't tell you much about him other than him being one tough son of a bitch. He was a longshoreman who worked his balls off on the waterfront. When he wasn't working, he spent most of his time on the bottle, making the rest of our lives miserable. On Friday's payday, he rewarded himself at the corner bar. He'd come staggering in through the front door of our home. Once in, his drunken bullshit started. My mother never raised her voice to him. None of us did. We were living in his home. We played by his rules. There were nights when I would sit at the top of the stairs watching him through the spindles in the banister throw my mother around like a rag doll. My sister Diane would stay in her bedroom on her knees, in front of the crucifix hung over her bed, praying for it to stop. Her prayers went unanswered. Other than that, there isn't much good I can say about him except that he'd sleep off his load, never miss a day at work, and he taught me how to handle myself. He used to be an amateur boxer. He'd take me down the basement to put on the gloves. He'd hit me hard, and if I cried, he hit me harder. My sister also attended St. Martin's. She was an honor student. My grades were way below average. I was somewhat of a disciplinary problem. I had to repeat the 5th grade, which only added to my troubles. Not too many kids were held back in those days. When they were, there were no excuses, no dyslexia, or any other disorders. You were just flat out stupid. It bothered me at first. I felt like some kind of retard. But the advantages of staying back one year outweighed the disadvantages. The way it was explained to me the second time around, I might actually learn something. I could have stayed back 5 times around, but it wouldn't have helped. I just couldn't learn a thing in that school. It wasn't like I was brain dead. Actually, my mind was working fine. It just wouldn't work for them. I never did homework or studied for a test. I wouldn't think of trying to answer a question during classes. The only time I showed any interest was during religion class, but not the kind you could openly express. After a few whacks around, I learned not to mess with their Holy Bible stories. There was this one time when I was called on to come up to the front of the classroom to explain what has always been a hard sale for them, the Immaculate Conception. I was almost hung on a cross for asking why God wasted his time making the Blessed Mother pregnant, when he could have created Jesus the same way he did Adam and Eve, as adults. Even after a couple of smacks on my knuckles and a few hours on my knees praying for forgiveness, I still thought it sounded like a good idea. I really wanted to believe those fabulous stories, but I just couldn't buy them, especially the one about how God let his only son be tortured to death for our sins. When I first heard that one and saw those gruesome pictures, I thought to myself, if that were my son, I would have been down there kicking some ass. It didn't take long for me to draw my own conclusion. There were some pretty good bullshit artists back in those days. It was a good thing Spielberg wasn't around back then, or us Christians would be worshiping E.T. instead of J.C. Chapter 2. The following year, I began my new school career at Fells Junior Public High School. It's a dream come true for every hoodlum expelled from a parochial school. What freedom? No white shirts, neckties, nuns, priests, and no Hun. On my first day, I had to sit through a lecture from the principal, Mr. Kaufman. He emphasized that he had a zero tolerance for any type of misbehavior at his school. He took me down the corridor to another office and introduced me to my counselor, Dr. Powell, who was some kind of head shrink. I had to report to him once a week. By now, I knew when it came to book savvy, I was definitely handicapped. But when it came to head games, I could hold my own and then some. After all, I'd been playing them for the last 9 years with nuns and priests. I had fared fairly well at St. Martin's considering they didn't want to hear any excuses. It was their way, or the highway. During my first days at Fells Junior High, I couldn't believe how disorganized this school was. It was a zoo, students running through the corridors and shooting down the stairways like uncaged monkeys. I thought to myself, what could I possibly learn in this madhouse? It looked to me that discipline was definitely not one of their strong points. This should have been easy pickings, but it wasn't as easy as I thought. Back in St. Martin's, you stayed in one classroom all day. At Fells, we jumped from class to class. It took me over a week to find my classes and remember my locker combination. Of course, I immediately hooked up with the wrong crowd, most of whom were ex-veterans of other parochial schools. But the real wackos were the ones brought up through the public school system. Now I was in with the real heavyweights. I'm talking about major crimes, from car theft to house robberies, huffing glue, drinking Robitussin cough medicine before and after school. For the first time, I was way out of my league. The crimes I committed at St. Martin's wouldn't even make honorable mention at Fells. All of my friends were Gentiles, but the school was primarily Jewish. We ran the joint. Most of the Jews were terrified of us, but there were exceptions. One day I was on my way home from school and there was a gang of my new friends picking on some Jewish kids. This one kid in our gang was called the Beast. He had a reputation of being the toughest kid in Fells. He was bullying this Jewish kid, trying to lure him into a fight. The kid was in my homeroom. His name was Marty Cohen. That week he helped me with a science project. After class, I told him that I owed him one. He replied, 1? More like 3? The Beast kept pushing Marty, calling him a Jew pussy. Marty fired back, calling the Beast a jerk-off in some kind of Jewish term. A dumb goy. The Beast knocked Marty down to the ground. Marty kept trying to get up, but the Beast kept knocking him down. Another kid brought over a stick with a piece of dog shit on it. They were going to put it in Marty's mouth. As I watched, I kept thinking back how my father bullied my mother, and how one time a neighborhood bully like the Beast did the same thing to me. It was on a Halloween night. I was 10 years old. I started trick-or-treating early, and by 9 o'clock I had 2 full bags of candy. I was on my way home when suddenly, from out of nowhere, an older kid from the neighborhood ran up behind me, grabbed the 2 bags from my hands. In a flash, all of my candy was gone. When I tried to get it back from him, he knocked me down and then rubbed a piece of candy in my face. I was scared and cried all the way home. I knew I couldn't go home empty-handed with tears in my eyes. The old man would have killed me. He could have cared less about the candy, but not fighting back was unheard of. Bad news travels fast in the old neighborhood, and before I made it up our street, my father was on his way down. He took me back to the corner where the bully and his friends hung out. They were busy dividing my candy up among themselves. When they saw my old man, they immediately froze in their tracks. I pointed out the jerk who took my candy. I thought that my father intended to straighten him out. Instead, he made me fight the bully right then and there on the corner. I was scared, but had no choice. My father would have beaten me a lot worse than the bully. It's sad to say, but like I said before, fighting was the only thing my father ever taught me. And he taught me good. He wanted his son to be the next heavyweight champ of the world. That night it paid off. Before the bully could even raise his hands, I hit him with a straight left jab, followed by a short right to his breadbasket. He lost his breath and fell to his knees. "Finish him off," my father demanded. I looked at him. "Do it," he said. I didn't want to hit him while he was down, but I felt I had no choice. I stood there with my fists clenched. Then I let loose with rights and lefts to his face. Blood was everywhere. I looked at my father and he was quite satisfied. I'm thinking he should only know how many times I would have liked to do the same to him. By now, the Beast was holding Marty down on the ground. They were just about to put the dog shit in his mouth, but I had seen enough. I pushed the Beast off Marty, got on top of him and started punching him in the face. He screamed for me to get off as blood ran from his nose and mouth. Before I let him get up, I said, "If you ever pick on another Jew, I'll kill you." The rest of his gang couldn't believe it. The Beast was dead and a new kingpin had emerged. As the Beast limped away, Marty picked up the stick with the dog shit and shoved it in his face. Before we went our separate ways that day, Marty reminded me that our score was almost settled for that science project he helped me with. This kid had balls. I just saved his ass, and now he's telling me that we're almost even. As he was walking away, he hollered back, "You're all right for a goy." I wasn't exactly sure what he meant, but I found out later it was short for Goya, meaning non-Jew. After that day, school wasn't quite the same. A new gang had emerged, half Jews and half Gentiles. We called ourselves the League of Nations. Nobody fucked with us. Marty was the brains of our gang, and I was the muscle. He was a thief and con artist, able to get his hands on anything from blank report cards to early dismissal slips. He only had to see a parent's signature once before he had it down to perfection. He gave me my first nickname, the Goy. In return, I named him the Jew. His nickname lasted only a day or two, as you can imagine. The Goy has stuck with me for a long time. Chapter 4. At that time, the government was having trouble getting young men to enlist. It was no longer just hippies complaining. Even the veterans from other wars wanted answers. It was getting really difficult for our government to sell this crazy war to the masses, especially being we're supposedly the strongest nation on the planet. Yet every night on TV, we saw a bunch of third world bush people kicking our butts. So some asshole in Washington came up with the brilliant idea for a lottery. I guess they figured everybody likes to gamble. It's the American way. The master plan was to randomly pick capsules that had birth dates in them out of a giant container. If your birth date was among the first 100 drawn, you were a goner. With the next 100 selected, you had a 50-50 chance. The rest would skate. Of course, conspiracy theories were coming out of the woodwork. I especially loved the one I heard this radical hippie dude on TV come up with. He said that the government knew the exact number of males born on each date. Supposedly, they would make the capsules with those higher number of births in them weight less. That would bring them to the top when they put them in the container. His theory was scary, but then again, smoking too much pot made you paranoid. Well, you know what happens when everything is going smoothly. Someone always turns on the fan. This time it's Uncle Sam with the hottest game in town. Broadcasting live at 8 p.m. for the first time ever on national TV. Win a free trip to Vietnam. I have seen some major events on TV from the first time Elvis appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Shit, they were scary times. I can remember those air raid drills in school, where we would duck under our desk praying to God that there wouldn't be a nuclear war. Then there was the assassination of John F. Kennedy, followed by Jack Ruby shooting Lee Harvey Oswald. Then Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King getting it. But none of those events would have an impact on my life as much as this one. For me, this was the show of shows. A lot of my friends were trying to figure out a way to beat the draft. If they weren't in college, they tried enlisting in the reserves, but many others did too, so that didn't last long. Many started seeing a shrink. Having a drug addiction was very popular at that time. That's when the rehab business started to flourish. There I was stuck in the middle once again. Many of my Gentile friends who weren't all fucked up on drugs they were enlisting, while my Jewish friends were finding ways to beat the draft. There I was with no high school diploma, finally on track, learning a new career. I'm making good money while trying my best to escape from my colorless world. And so far, my luck hadn't been that bad. So I took my chances with the lottery, and that night had finally arrived. In my neighborhood, people were having lottery parties. Bring your own beer, pretzels, and don't forget your nuts. I stayed home and got really religious that day. I know it sounds hard to believe, and if I hadn't seen it for myself, I wouldn't have believed it either. There it was on the TV, a big container filled with capsules. I was playing in a nationwide game, and for many of the losers it was a death sentence, and they wondered why our generation did drugs. This bulldog-looking guy with a crew-cut hairdo and a dark suit slowly reached into the container when it stopped spinning and took out the first capsule. He opens it and takes out a small note with July 26th on it. He hands it to another guy and he puts it on the board. He takes out the next capsule and so on. I never did any gambling or any kind of risk-taking back then, but I did know the feeling of the unknown. This was no different to me from the nights I waited for the old man to come home with a load on, or those times when I was lured into a fight and how the fear I felt in the beginning would turn to anger, followed by a rush of adrenaline flowing through my body, and suddenly I was invincible. That's pretty much how I felt not being picked by the 38th capsule. I was still alive. However, my hopes were soon shattered. On the 39th pick, they nailed me. I couldn't believe it. 2 years in the military would put me in a hole one way or another. It had nothing to do with Vietnam. I just couldn't afford to lose that kind of time. Chapter 5. December 1973. The day after Christmas, I drove Morris and Shirley to the Philly airport. They were going to Hawaii for the first time. A lot of things have changed in the past 4 years. The most unexpected was my relationship with Shirley. Now that I have proven myself to be more than capable of running their factory, Shirley has been dragging Morris at least twice a year on what she called her exotic vacations. I'm now Shirley's little boobala, and she slips me an extra $100 bill every week. Outside of working 6 days a week, life was pretty good. I was dating a few girls from both tribes, but nothing serious. The whole hippie thing was just about finished. The flower children who survived gave up all that peace and love crap. They hung up their beads, threw out their old bell-bottom jeans, and started buying gold chains and 8 tracks by Kool and the Gang. A new plague had arrived called disco. If you thought we looked funny in the 60s, then picture this: platform shoes, polyester pants, printed silk shirts accented with a gold chain, Elvis sideburns, and a hairdo with enough hairspray on it that you'd wish your dick would stay as hard. And there were plenty of drugs: cocaine for your nose, ludes for the hoes. I kept my nose clean, and I didn't need ludes to get laid. So I stayed with the drug of my choice, making money and reaching for the good life. I had my own apartment with shag carpeting, a wall unit with a color TV, and a good sound system. There was enough plexiglass, chrome, and mirrors in the decor that on a sunny day, you could open the drapes and get a tan without leaving the apartment. My bathroom had wall-to-wall carpeting, a shower curtain, and accessories to match my soft-cushioned toilet seat. If you took a peek out front, you see my '73 red Corvette parked by the curb. I had just walked into the office when Mona, our secretary, answered the phone. "Richie, it's Shirley," she said. I took the call in my office. "Shirley, how are you, and what's Morris up to?" "Well, doll, he's doing better," she said. "Better?" I said. "Better than what?" "After dinner last night, Morris started having chest pains. I took him straight to the hospital. Thank God it wasn't a heart attack, but they wanted him to stay overnight just to be safe." She went on complaining about all of the wrong foods he ate. After a good 10 minutes on the phone with Shirley, I started to get chest pains. They returned home a week earlier than expected. I drove down to the airport to pick them up early Sunday morning. He departed the plane in a wheelchair. He didn't look good. His face was drawn, and he looked older. As I wheeled him through the airport, I didn't say anything to him about his health. I passed along the good news about his business. A deal he was working on with a chain of department stores out west came through, and Al Katz had signed a lease for a store in a new mall scheduled to open that spring. I could tell he had more important issues on his mind than business. On the drive back to their house, he fell asleep in the back of the car. Shirley told me that she was taking Morris to a cardiologist, and we should keep his condition to ourselves. I agreed. There was no sense in feeding the wolves, but there was one exception. Morris only trusted Al Katz. You could forget about his other accounts. At first I used to think he was a little paranoid, but it didn't take long to see where he was coming from. We lost a few accounts over the years, but when we lost Coleman's department stores, Morris was beside himself. In the 20 years that he did business with them, he never had a problem. He always bent over backwards for them, so he couldn't understand why they suddenly stopped doing business with him. Later, he found out that they had hired a new buyer, a real asshole from California. Without even the decency of a phone call, he refused all new orders. Morris tried for a week to get in touch with him, to no avail. Losing the account was bad enough, but not knowing the reason why was driving him crazy. He deserved to know why he lost this account. He needed an answer. When Morris finally got to talk to the buyer, he said they were dealing with a company out of Mexico that gave them better pricing and delivery. There wasn't much Morris could do about it. That's when I first heard the term wetback labor. Morris rambled on and on for days. "We're in a cutthroat business," he said. "It's no different than running a whorehouse. Everyone is trying to fuck you. The days of loyalty are over. They leave us just to save pennies. And what about us Americans? Don't we have to eat too? Today it's Mexicans. Tomorrow it will be the Chinese. What did I do wrong? So I made one little mistake. What? I was a few days late on one delivery. After all these years, it's just not fair?" I calmed him down with one of my Uncle Anthony's favorite lines. "It's sort of like you may have only sucked one cock," I said, "but you'll always be a cocksucker." That's it, he said with a smile. "That's the answer I was looking for. You hit it right on the head." For some inexplicable reason, I always had the knack to lift his spirits. The following year, Morris's health began to deteriorate. He was in and out of the hospital. I was given more responsibilities, which I accepted. I was earning decent money, but like most employees, I felt that I was worth more. There were two other manufacturers in the building. One made women's lingerie, the other plastic slipcovers. One day I was approached by one of them. He took me out to dinner at a well-known restaurant in Center City. He wined and dined me while offering me more money, as he buried any notion that there might be a future with Morris. I told him that while his offer sounded good, I would have to sleep on it. When I got home that night, I didn't get much sleep. I was stuck between the fuck 'em or don't fuck 'em syndrome. Fuck 'em would say, nothing for nothing. You worked your balls off for him. You made him a lot of money and in the process made his life a lot easier. Don't fuck 'em would say, would you do that to a man who has turned your whole life and world around? Where would you be today without his help? Probably digging ditches or worse yet, being buried in a ditch somewhere in Vietnam. The don'ts outweighed the fuck 'ems. During the first order of business the following morning, I told Morris about the job offer. He laughed for a moment, then sat down at his desk. How did you sleep last night? He asked. Not very well, I said. Well, I don't think you're going to sleep any better tonight either. He stood up, walked over to the safe, opened it, and took out the books. I felt Mr. Fuckham was about to pay me a visit. How long has it been since that day at Moe's when I first offered you a job? He asked. It's been over 6 years. Have I been fair with you all these years? Morris, you've always treated me like a son. That's why I would never try to screw you. I just thought you should know about the offer. You did the right thing by telling me. You know, I would have hated to hear it from someone else. Now let's get down to business. Are you open to counter offers? I knew he was kidding with me, so I played right back. Morris, I want to stay with you. There is no more you can offer me that will tempt me to leave. I think you've made the right decision. I'm getting up in age. You know my health is not the best. I have plenty of money. So Shirley and I have made a major decision. It's time for me to retire. Morris, retire? You're kidding, right? It's time, Richie, and if everything goes according to plan, by this time next year, God willing, we hope to be living in Florida. Now my problem is, what am I going to do with the business? If I put it up for sale, there's a good possibility that we could lose some of our accounts while waiting for the right buyer. I'll be honest with you, there aren't that many buyers out there today, and I don't have the time or the patience to look for one. So, tell me, Morris, what are you going to do? Shirley and I have talked it over, and we want you to take over the business. I have it all mapped out right here in these books. I was going to wait until after the holidays to talk to you about it. Now that you're in such high demand, I better grab you while I can. We spent the rest of the day going over the books. The price of the business was $300,000 above the table, and another $100,000 in cash under the table. Kiddingly, I said, Morris, that's a lot of cash. We're going to have to get a bigger table. The business was grossing a little under $700,000 a year. After expenses, the net profit was over $100,000. Morris showed me how to keep 2 sets of books, one for Uncle Sam, the other for Uncle Me. Al Katz was a genuine half-patriot. He paid half check and half cash. I was given 10 years to pay Morris out with no interest and no money down. It was the perfect deal for me and a better one for him. At that time, there were a lot of businessmen in Philly, mostly Jewish, in the same predicament. They went into business after World War II and worked day and night to make their dreams come true. They made sure that their children had every opportunity to succeed in life. The children who were smart enough to take advantage of those opportunities attended good colleges, earned their degrees, and pursued professional careers. Rarely did they choose to get involved in the family business. When the hippie plague hit, there were more than a few parents from all tribes who lost children to drug abuse. From what I had seen, the Jewish families in Philly and the surrounding suburbs who, like the Cohens, owned businesses, took heavy casualties. After we finished going over the books that day, he took me out to dinner. No fancy restaurant downtown this time. We ended up back at Moe's Deli, where our history had started. Before we parted that evening, we stood outside in Moe's parking lot, and Morris said, Richie, life is a funny game. You never know what cards it will deal to you. I always thought that one day I would be turning everything over to Marty. He hesitated for a moment, then said, I want you to know I'm glad it's you, and I'm sure that Marty would be too. We shook hands, then hugged one another with tears in our eyes. There was nothing more to say. The deal was made. That was the last time I ever heard him say Marty's name, and the last time he bought me dinner. I was in my second year as the owner when Morris and Shirley sold their house and moved to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. That's the pit stop for every retired Jewish businessman before heading to the promised land. I also made a move. I'm renting an apartment in an upscale high-rise building in Center City, Philly, 20 minutes from my factory. At the age of only 26, I was the youngest and largest manufacturer of children's clothing in Philadelphia. Not bad for a goy with a 10th grade education. I just finished putting the top up on my Eldorado when I saw Al pull up in his Lincoln Continental. He got out of his car. He was struggling with his briefcase, a few bakery boxes. I ran up, grabbed the boxes, and we headed to the elevator. We got to the office where my secretary Mona had coffee brewing. After a cup of coffee with a couple cannolis and Al's fifth cigarette, we started working on his fall order. It would usually take a good part of the day to write up Al's order, but today wasn't a usual day. The first casino in Atlantic City was having its grand opening that weekend, and Al was invited. He loved casinos. He would visit Vegas a few times a year. He said that a good friend of his from Vegas got him a comped room in Atlantic City for the weekend. I didn't know what he meant by comped room, but I figured it must be something nice. When it came to placing an order, no one was faster than Al. He would zip through the showroom, talking non-stop, with a cigarette moving in and out of his mouth as he shouted out his order. Give me 6 dozen of that, 4 dozen of those, sizes 6 to 12, 12 to 18, 18 to 24 months in pink, blue, and peach. It was a real workout just trying to keep up with him. On that particular day, he was in overdrive. We finished with his order before lunch. Before he left that day, he invited me down on Saturday night to Atlantic City's new casino for dinner, and to do a little gambling. I told him I'd love to, but I had too much work to do around the factory. I thanked him for the offer and the business. I wished him good luck. He rushed out the door, leaving behind some samples that he needed for the following week. He called me later that afternoon from Atlantic City and said that his daughter, Jackie, would be in Philly later that day. He asked me if I could wait for her. I told him it would be my pleasure. I asked him how he was making out in the casino. He said he hasn't gambled yet. It's so crowded you can't even find a slot machine, let alone a craps or blackjack table to play on. I wished him good luck again. In all the years I've done business with Al, we rarely talked about our families. I knew Jackie graduated from Penn State, but that was about it. I hadn't seen her since Marty's funeral more than 9 years ago. It was just about 5 o'clock when the phone rang. It was Jackie. She was lost on the other side of the city, not far from where I lived. We made arrangements to meet at a nearby parking lot. I gathered all the samples together and left the office. It took me half an hour to get to her. Not to my surprise, she was prettier than I had imagined. She had the prettiest blue eyes that I had ever seen. She smiled graciously at me. I could feel a warmth surge through my body. Hello, Richie, it's been a long time. Almost 10 years, I said. I stood there speechless and lost in those blue eyes. Do you have something for me? She asked. Oh yeah, I said. I reached into my car for the samples. The whole time I was fumbling around in the back of my car, my mind was racing. I can't let her leave. I have to think of something to hold her interest. Wait a minute, maybe she's engaged or involved with someone, or worse yet, doesn't like me. Then I thought to myself, wait a minute, pull yourself together. These aren't the old days, and I'm not some dumb goy from the old neighborhood just doing her father a favor. I'm a successful businessman driving a new caddy. I have money too. Be cool, I said to myself. When I handed her the samples, I made sure to check her hands. There was no sign of any hookup. I really appreciate your coming all the way over here, she said. I would never have found your factory, especially in all this traffic. She got prettier with every word she spoke. By now, the rush hour traffic had begun. I suggested that she should wait at least an hour before starting back home to Jersey. That sounds like a good idea, she said. But what will I do to kill an hour? She asked. There were a lot of things I thought of suggesting. For instance, we could go back to my place, have a few drinks, then hop in the sack and fuck our brains out all night. I've used lines like that with broads in nightclubs and scored, but Jackie is no ordinary broad. I had a better idea. How about leaving our cars here for now and taking a walk down South Street? There are a few new restaurants that just opened, unless, of course, you have other plans for the evening? She looked at her watch, then paused for a moment. Richie, are you asking me out to dinner? Well, I mean, you know, I said. I figured if you have the time to kill, why not spend it with me? It's not like a date. It's more like, you know, an accommodation. No, wait a minute. I didn't really mean it like that. Before I could put my foot further in my mouth, she stopped me. Richie, I'd love to have dinner with you. That was all she had to say. I knew from that moment this was going to be something special. We couldn't decide on what kind of food to eat. Then it hit me. It's Friday night. What was I thinking? We have to eat chinks. It's a Jewish tradition. We got in my caddy and it was off to Chinatown. We ate and laughed while falling in love. When we got back to her car, neither one of us wanted to leave. We both knew the proper way to start off a relationship. Trading phone numbers. Dating for a few weeks to learn more about each other, along with all the other expected bullshit. The following morning, we awakened as one. From that moment, we both knew we would be inseparable. Chapter 8. It was the week before the Memorial Day holiday, and I was about to leave my office when Al called from Florida. "Yo, Al, what's happening?" "We're coming in Memorial Day weekend," he said after a series of hard coughs. "That's great," I said. "We made no plans for the weekend. I'll pick you up at the airport." "Thanks for the offer," he said. "But we're going to Atlantic City, so start packing your bags. Got us a comped 2-bedroom suite at the Golden Mines Hotel and Casino. They're sending a limo to pick us up at the airport." "A limo? Well, pardon me, Mr. Big Shot," I said jokingly. "How'd you do it, Al? I tried to get us a room at a few hotel casinos, but couldn't get us a tent on the beach." "That's because they only want gamblers, not vacationers," he said with a raspy voice. "My casino host in Vegas took care of everything. Tell Raymond they got an indoor swimming pool. Now how's my grandson doing?" "He's getting big," I said. "This fall, I'm signing him up for midget football. He'll probably be the only Jew on the team." Al started laughing. "Wait until I tell your mother-in-law," he said. "Hey, Al, there was nothing in that contract I signed with the rabbi about Raymond not being allowed to play football, was there?" "I'm not sure about that," he said while coughing. "Do me a favor, Al, and tell Irene not to worry. I'll make sure he wears his yarmulke under his helmet." I could always kid around with Al. Our relationship grew stronger throughout the years. He always liked to bet long shots, and I was his biggest one. Al's health was deteriorating the last few years. He's been in and out of the hospital, but he never complained. He knows that if anything ever happened to him, we would take care of Irene. Memorial Day weekend 1984. This was our first time staying in a hotel casino. Jackie and I have been in Atlantic City casinos before, but neither one of us liked to gamble. We went to the restaurants and shows when we could get in, which was rare. Like Al said, they only want gamblers. Al and Irene were waiting in the crowded lobby. They were both so happy to see us, and when Al held Raymond in his arms, his face lit up with joy. I was surprised that he looked as good as he did. Al was smoking like a chimney. Irene telling him to stop, but he kept lighting another one. I followed Al to the front desk. He was moving through the casino lobby the way he used to move when he was buying merchandise at my factory. We got to the sign with the VIP on it. I stood off to the side as Al checked us in. This guy in a dark suit came up behind Al. He puts his hand on Al's shoulder. Al turns. "Steve, it's been a long time," Al says as they shook hands. "Al, welcome to the Golden Mines," Steve said. "How the hell have you been, and where is your beautiful wife?" Irene walked over, and this guy Steve gave her a kiss on the cheek, then told her she looked fabulous. Then Al brought Steve over to where we were standing and introduced us. While the bellhop was getting our bags together, Jackie and Irene took Raymond to the gift shop. I stood off to the side and listened to Al and his friend Steve bullshitting about Vegas and Atlantic City. Then Steve hands Al his business card and says, "Al, don't forget now, if there's anything you need, just give me a call. I want to make your stay here a most enjoyable and memorable one." We took the elevator up to the 18th floor and entered the suite. It was elegantly decorated in a Victorian decor. After unpacking, we took a tour of the hotel. This place was by far the nicest hotel that Jackie and I had ever been in, and it provided every service a guest might desire. There were 4 5-star restaurants, a New York deli, 2 lounges featuring live entertainment, and a showroom called the Opera House. It had an indoor pool, spa, and on one floor were designer brand shops for men and women. Then there was the main attraction, the casino, which was open from 10 a.m. to 4 a.m., Sunday through Thursday, and from 10 a.m. to 6 a.m., Fridays, Saturdays, and holidays. We went back to our suite, put on our bathing suits, and headed to the beach. Al was already down in the casino. When we got to the beach, there were bright yellow striped cabanas that lead the way to the ocean. It looked like a sultan's army camped out on a desert. The hotel provided beach chairs and towels. They made everything enjoyable. It was hard to believe that finally there was a place you could go on vacation that was so close to home, and yet made you feel as though you were on a remote island so far away. We stayed on the beach until 4 o'clock. When we got back to the suite, Al was napping. Raymond brought back a seashell he found in the ocean for his pop-pop. He went to put it on the nightstand where there was a stack of $500 purple chips. He accidentally knocked the chips on the floor. Al woke up and I handed him his chips and said, "It looks like your lucky day." Al smiled and said, "If I pressed more, I would have had 3 times that amount." Then he said he got us a comp for dinner at the Dragon Inn Chinese restaurant. "What's with this comp stuff?" I asked. "That's a long story," he said. "I'll explain it to you later." "That's one thing I hope you never learn about," Irene said in passing. It was a little after 8 when we finished dinner. Jackie and Raymond were exhausted, so they went back to the suite. Al, Irene, and I went down to the casino. Irene went off to play the slot machines. Al went right to the craps table and I followed. He stood at one end of a green felt table that had a lot of strange writing and numbers on it. He changes his $500 purple chips into $100 black and $25 green chips. Then he throws black and green chips down on the table. He starts hollering out numbers and things like hard this and soft that and yo's while coughing through the cigarette hanging out of his mouth. He's got the whole table going. A cocktail waitress brings him a tall glass of scotch. He flirts with her, then tips her from his stack of chips. I had no idea what the hell was going on. After a couple throws of the dice, I slipped away and started walking through the casino. I never gambled in the casino before, but I did play in a few card games, so I knew a little bit about blackjack. I started watching other players at the blackjack tables to familiarize myself with the game. Most of the tables were a $25 minimum bet. It wasn't about to sit at one of those. I walked around for almost an hour before I found an open seat at the end of a $5 minimum table. I sat down and read the little sign on the table. $5 minimum to $500 maximum. It also said that the dealer stands on 17 and blackjack pays 3-2. It said that the table could be changed within a half hour's notice. I took out 2 $100 bills and laid them on the green felt table. The dealer picked up my money, looked over his shoulder and hollered, "Changing 200. Behind him stood an attractive woman wearing a casino ID badge. She nodded for her approval. The dealer gave me $25 red chips and 4 $25 green chips. I played for what seemed to be less than an hour, but was actually closer to 2 hours. I had no idea what I was doing, but it didn't matter. The bottom line was I was winning. Every time I bet a stack of red chips and won, the dealer paid me in $25 green chips. The next thing I knew, I'm betting stacks of green chips winning and getting paid with $100 black chips. Attractive woman with Carla Galleon on her ID badge comes over to the table and tells everyone that in the next half hour this would be a $25 table. She asked me for my name so she could rate my play. Again, I was lost, but I didn't want her or the other players to think that. So I gave her my name and date of birth. Half an hour later, she took the red sign off the table and put up a green one. It read $25 minimum to $1,000 maximum. I started to think that the only reason they changed the table was because of me. Most of the other players left the table. The dealer started shuffling a new shoe. The shoe is the plexiglass container where the cards come out from. I'm sitting there thinking I ain't ready for this. It wasn't easy getting off the table, especially since I was winning, but I couldn't picture myself betting up to $1,000 a hand. I got all my chips together and stood up. A few new players sat down. One guy asked me something about an anchor. I had no idea what he's talking about. He must think I owned a boat. The dealer leans in and tells me the last seat at the table is the anchor. Then he asked me for all my chips. For a moment I thought that maybe I had done something wrong, or worse yet, maybe I had lost. "Didn't I win?" I asked. "Of course you won, sir," he said in a friendly way. "I just want to color them up for you." "Man, I have to learn this casino lingo," I said. Then he explained that he was going to give me higher value chips in exchange for a lesser value once. That way I wouldn't have to walk around the casino carrying a lot of chips. That made sense to me. He gave me back 2 $500 purple chips, 3 $100 blacks, 2 $25 greens, and 3 $5 red chips. I took the 2 greens along with the 3 red chips and tried to hand them to the dealer as a tip. He told me that I would have to leave them on the table because he wasn't allowed to take them out of my hand. I laid them on the table, then strolled, or should I say floated across the casino floor with my winnings in hand to the cashier's cage. When I gave the cashier my chips, she asked me if I had any markers. Here we go again. Markers, now what could they be? I told her I only have the chips. She smiled, then took my chips and counted out 13 brand new $100 bills. My first time gambling in the casino, and I turned a $200 investment into an $1,100 profit. I couldn't wait to tell Jackie. I walked past the craps tables on the way up to our suite, and I could hear Al calling out numbers. I woke Jackie and told her of my good fortune. "That's great," she said. "I knew I married a lucky man." The rest of the weekend was fabulous. The restaurants, shows, gambling, and even the weather was perfect. Al just signed his name for everything we did. I wanted to pay for something, but he kept saying it's all comped. That weekend, I won over $2,000. Al told me he broke even, but I wasn't sure he was telling me the truth. He didn't look good. Maybe it was from all the hollering, smoking, drinking, and excitement at the craps table. When we said goodbye that weekend, I could sense it wasn't the same as usual. Al put his arms around Jackie and me and held us for a long time. Jackie started crying. It was as though he was trying to tell us for the last time how much he loved us. He took Raymond in his arms, his only grandchild, and held him for what seemed like an eternity. On the way home, Raymond was quieter than usual. Then from out of nowhere, he asked if Pop-Pop was going to die. He must have sensed something too. "Pop-Pop is very sick," Jackie said, "but before he feels any pain, God will take him to heaven." The following week, Al was rushed to the hospital. His battle with emphysema was about to end. We were on the next flight out of Philadelphia, and the plane was already 30 minutes late. There wasn't much time to spare. Al had insisted on dying at home. His doctor respected his final wishes. As we entered the lobby of the condo, Morris was waiting to intercept us. Jackie hadn't stopped crying since we left Philly. She had never allowed herself to anticipate her father's death. Morris put his arms around her, and I took Raymond in my arms. He closed his eyes and laid his head on my shoulder. "Is Pop-Pop in heaven?" After a couple of minutes, we gulped down our sobs and went up to comfort Irene. She was totally out of it. Jackie took her quietly in her arms and held her tight. I put my arms around both of them and told Irene how sorry I was. A lot of people have come and gone in my life, but Al was one I'd surely miss. Jackie and Raymond stayed in Florida with my mother-in-law for the next 2 weeks. While they were there, and I having some free time on my hands, I went back to the Golden Mines Casino to learn everything I could about this game, blackjack. From splitting cards, doubling down, when to buy insurance, and when I should surrender.